taught to feel, but not to discern what you are feeling. You have been told that empathy is good, that to carry the emotions of others is noble, but few have asked whether such empathy is pure or whether it is poisoned by unconscious motives. This, I must say, is one of the greatest hidden tragedies of the human psyche. The inability to distinguish between clean empathy that arises from the self and contaminated empathy that emerges from shadow, from projection, from unresolved wounds buried in the unconscious. For what you call compassion often conceals compulsion, and what you call love often masks fear, guilt, or a secret desire to dominate under the cloak of virtue. When you sit across from another human being, you are not simply present to them, you are immersed in a living field of psychic energy. Their pain resonates with your unhealed pain. Their longing vibrates with your unmet longing. If you are unconscious, you do not meet them as they are, but rather through the veil of your complexes. You see in them not only who they are, but who you were forbidden to be. That is where empathy becomes contaminated. It is no longer an act of recognition, but a reenactment of trauma. You do not feel them, you feel yourself through them, without knowing it. And this confusion, if unchecked, leads to sacrifice without wisdom, martyrdom without purpose, and relationships where one soul feeds on another while believing it is giving clean empathy, in contrast, is born of individuation. It arises when the self, the eternal center of the psyche, recognizes another self. It does not collapse into the other suffering, but bears witness to it. Clean empathy does not confuse sympathy with merger. It does not devour or allow itself to be devoured. It is a listening, a holding, a deep seeing, without losing the boundary that protects one's own integrity. In clean empathy, you can sit with another's darkness without drowning, because you have made peace with your own. You do not need them to be healed in order for you to be whole. That is the difference. Contaminated empathy is a hidden bargain. I will carry your pain so that I do not have to face my own. Clean empathy is a sacred presence. I see your pain and I will not abandon you, but I will not mistake it for my own. But the modern world, enamored with sentimentality, has not taught you this distinction. From childhood, you were praised for being kind, for being good, for being selfless, but rarely for being whole. Wholeness frightens the collective because it demands differentiation, the courage to stand apart, and so you were conditioned to dissolve into others, to please, to rescue, to feel responsible for what was never yours to carry. That is why so many of you find yourselves exhausted, disoriented, filled with burdens that are not of your making. You confuse empathy with salvation. You confuse love with fusion. And in doing so, you betray both yourself and the other, because no one truly benefits from a connection built upon unconscious wounds. Imagine for a moment a woman who dreams that she is carrying a basket of fruit through a crowded marketplace. People come to her hungry and she gives to each, but no matter how much she gives, the fruit in her basket never runs out. This is clean empathy. It flows from the self, which is inexhaustible. She can give without depletion, because what she gives is not stolen from her own reserves. but from a deeper source. Now imagine the same woman, but her basket is small, and every time she gives, she feels emptier, hungrier, more desperate. She resents those who take, yet she cannot stop giving, for she feels guilty if she does not. That is contaminated empathy. It is rooted not in abundance, but in compulsion. She does not give because she is free, she gives because she cannot say no. And beneath her generosity lies fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, to fear of being unloved if she dares to withhold. One is an act of creation, the other is a reenactment of trauma. You see, dreams reveal the truth of empathy more clearly than waking consciousness, for they expose the archetypal layer beneath our moral disguises. The dream of the inexhaustible basket points to the archetype of the Great Mother in her luminous aspect, nurturing, abundant, life-giving. But the dream of the emptying basket points to the devouring mother, the archetype distorted, contaminated, feeding others while secretly consuming herself. Both wear the mask of empathy, but only one is truly clean. And this is why the unconscious must be confronted, for without it you cannot discern the purity of your motives. I must tell you something that many resist. Empathy is not always a virtue. It can be a defense or strategy, even a form of possession. When you feel too much of another, you may actually be invaded by their psychic material. You have opened your boundary unconsciously. Perhaps because as a child you had no boundary. You learned to feel your mother's moods in order to survive, to anticipate her anger, to soothe her despair. That is the birthplace of contaminated empathy, when the child becomes the parent of the parent, when the innocent becomes the container of the adult's unresolved shadow. Such children grow into adults who carry everyone else's pain as if it were their vocation. But it is not vocation, it is wound. To heal is to learn that empathy must be rooted in choice, not compulsion. Otherwise, it is merely trauma disguised as kindness. Let me speak of projection. When empathy is contaminated, you project onto the other what you cannot bear to acknowledge in yourself. You see their suffering, but secretly you are drawn to it because it mirrors your own disowned suffering. You help them not out of freedom, but out of a hidden desire to redeem yourself through them. You cannot forgive your own weakness, so you try to forgive theirs. You cannot face your own rage, so you become endlessly patient with theirs. You call it empathy, but in truth, it is avoidance. Projection masquerades as compassion, but it binds both people in illusion. The other never truly feels seen, for you are not seeing them. You are seeing yourself refracted through their face. Clean empathy, by contrast, sees without projection. It honors the other as other. It does not collapse the distance, but holds it sacred. In this distance, true love is born. In contaminated empathy, there is always exhaustion. You leave encounters drained, emptied, sometimes even ill, because the energy exchange was unconscious. Your psyche has merged with another's without clarity, and in doing so, you have carried what was not meant to be yours. Clean empathy leaves you paradoxically both moved and centered. You may feel grief for the other, but you do not lose your ground. You leave with more wisdom, not less strength. This is why I say the boundary you were never taught is the boundary between self and other. Without this boundary, empathy is a flood that drowns. With it, empathy becomes a river that nourishes both banks. And so I must ask you, when you give, do you give freely or do you give with a hidden bargain? When you listen, do you listen from wholeness or do you listen in order to escape the silence within yourself? When you feel another's sorrow, do you enter it with them as a companion, or do you absorb it into yourself as if by carrying it you could erase your own? These are not questions of morality but of consciousness, for the unconscious always contaminates what is otherwise pure. To purify empathy is to make it conscious, to know the origin of your impulse. Is it rooted in the self or in the shadow? Is it the archetype of the healer or the complex of the wounded child seeking redemption? I will tell you of a patient who dreamt he was walking through a forest at night. He found a child weeping by a fire. He felt compelled to pick up the child and carry him. But the child grew heavier with every step until finally the man collapsed, crushed beneath the weight. When he awoke, he wept, for he realized that all his life he had been carrying the inner child of others, while neglecting his own. His empathy had been contaminated by the belief that he must rescue everyone else's child in order to silence the cries of his own. This dream was his liberation. He learned that true empathy required him first to hold his own inner child, to sit with his own tears, before he could stand beside another's. Otherwise, his empathy was merely displacement. Clean empathy arises when you have faced your own darkness. Only then can you look into another's eyes and not flinch. Only then can you say, I will not abandon you, without abandoning yourself. This is why individuation is not selfish. As many fear, it is the prerequisite for genuine compassion. The one who has not faced their shadow cannot truly empathize, for they will always seek in the other what they have not found within themselves. But the individuated person, who has embraced the opposites within, can meet another in wholeness. Their empathy is clean, not because it is detached, but because it is conscious. You see now that empathy is not one thing, it is a spectrum, a field, a mystery. At one end is contamination, where empathy is possession, compulsion, projection. At the other end is purity, where empathy is recognition, presence, wholeness. Between these poles lies the task of every human soul, to discern the difference, to purify the motive, to learn the boundary that was never taught. And in this discernment, life becomes clearer. Relationships become less burdened. Love becomes less desperate, for you no longer seek to save or be saved, but simply to meet. And that, my friends, is the essence of the self, the meeting of one center with another. In freedom, the heart of the human being longs to merge, to dissolve its separateness, to taste once again the primordial unity from which it emerged. This longing, however, is both sacred and dangerous. It is sacred because it reminds us that the self is greater than the ego, that we are not islands but currents in a vast ocean of psychic life. It is dangerous because the ego, afraid of its isolation, seeks counterfeit unity through fusion with others, confusing empathy with salvation. Here lies the subtle threshold where empathy becomes contaminated, when it is no longer a recognition of another's soul, but a desperate attempt to fill one's own emptiness. Many who consider themselves compassionate are, in truth, haunted by loneliness. Their empathy is a strategy to avoid facing the void within. They give endlessly, but beneath their giving is a silent plea. Do not leave me. Validate my worth. Confirm that I exist. This is not empathy, but dependency dressed in noble clothing. It is why such givers often feel betrayed, for their love carries an unconscious demand. They give in order to receive, though they will not admit it, even to themselves. And when the other does not reciprocate, their generosity curdles into resentment. That resentment is the shadow of contaminated empathy. To cleanse empathy is to purify it of these hidden bargains. One cannot do so by moral effort alone. It requires descent into the unconscious, into the dream world where motives take symbolic form. In the dream, you may see yourself walking through a village, offering bread to strangers, only to discover that each face you feed is a mask of your own. The dream reveals that your empathy is self-directed, that you are feeding others in the hope that someone finally will feed the child within you. Such revelations are painful, but they are the beginning of freedom. For once you know the hidden source of your compulsion, you are no longer its prisoner. Empathy, like love, must pass through the crucible of the shadow until you confront the shadow. You cannot distinguish between what you give freely and what you give under compulsion. This is why so many relationships, even those that appear altruistic, are rife with invisible chains. One partner plays the savior, the other the wounded soul, and together they dance in a tragic masquerade. They call it empathy, but it is bondage. The savior's need to heal conceals their fear of abandonment. The wounded one's need to be healed conceals their fear of responsibility. Each feeds the other's unconscious wound, and neither grows. Clean empathy shatters this pattern, for it does not need to rescue or be rescued. It can stand in the presence of suffering without being consumed, and it can love without demanding salvation in return. But to embody clean empathy, you must learn the language of symbols, for the unconscious speaks in images, not arguments. Consider the archetype of the healer. In its luminous form, it offers presence without possession, wisdom without coercion, but in its contaminated form, it becomes the wounded healer who cannot stop tending to others because they cannot face their own wound. Their empathy is endless because their inner wound is endless. They wander from person to person, bleeding into every relationship, hoping that by healing others they will accidentally heal themselves. Yet the unconscious is not fooled. The wound festers until it is faced directly. Only when the healer turns inward, tending to the wound with honesty, can their empathy become clean. Another symbol is that of the mirror. Clean empathy is like a polished mirror. It reflects the other as they are, without distortion. Contaminated empathy is like a cracked mirror. It reflects fragments of yourself onto the other, distorting both vision and relationship. To cleanse empathy is to polish the mirror, to remove the cracks of projection, so that when you look into another's eyes, you do not see merely yourself disguised, but the sacred mystery of the other. This is no easy task, for the human ego resists otherness. It wants to assimilate, to claim, to control, but true empathy respects alterity. It says, "You are not me. I cannot control you. I can only walk beside you." This humility is the fragrance of clean empathy. I remember a man who dreamt of standing at the edge of a river. On the far bank, a crowd of people called to him, begging for help. He waded into the river, and as he crossed, the water rose higher and higher until he was drowning. He awoke in terror, realizing that his life was spent in drowning empathy. He felt responsible for everyone, but he had no anchor in himself. In analysis, he learned to ask, what is mine to carry, and what belongs to another? This simple question became his boundary. He began to see that empathy without boundary is not love, but self-destruction. Only by standing on his own bank, firmly rooted in his own self, could he truly extend a hand to those on the other side without losing himself to the current. The boundary you were never taught is not a wall, but a membrane. A wall isolates, but a membrane breathes. It allows energy to pass through with discernment. In clean empathy, your psychic membrane is intact. You can feel the other's sorrow, but you let it pass through without clinging. In contaminated empathy, the membrane is torn and the other's sorrow seeps into your unconscious like a poison. You find yourself restless, fatigued, tormented by feelings that are not truly yours. Over time, this leads to burnout, depression, even physical illness. For the psyche and the body are not separate. The body bears what the psyche cannot contain. Thus, contaminated empathy is not merely a psychological hazard, it is a spiritual and physical one. To cleanse it is not optional, it is survival. But how do you cleanse empathy? The answer is paradoxical. You cleanse it by first turning it inward. You must empathize with your own shadow, your own child, your own forgotten self. Most people resist this, for it feels selfish. Yet, it is the deepest act of responsibility to sit with your own pain without running, without projecting, without disguising it as someone else's. Is the crucible of individuation. Only then does your empathy for others become authentic, for it no longer carries the hidden demand that they heal what you refuse to face. You see them not as a substitute for yourself, but as themselves. And in that seeing, true compassion is born. I must warn you, this journey is not without terror. To withdraw contaminated empathy is to face the emptiness it concealed. You may feel abandoned, for you no longer drown in others' emotions to avoid your own. You may feel exposed, for you no longer hide behind the mask of the rescuer. But if you endure this loneliness, you will discover a deeper presence rising within. The self emerges, vast and inexhaustible, and from that wellspring flows clean empathy. Then, like the woman in the dream with the inexhaustible basket, you can give without depletion. You can love without losing yourself. You can sit in another's darkness without being swallowed, because you carry your own inner flame. The world does not understand this. It will accuse you of being cold, of being selfish, when you refuse to carry what is not yours. But this accusation is the voice of the collective shadow which fears individuation, for a differentiated individual threatens the herd because they cannot be manipulated by guilt, they cannot be drained by those who live unconsciously. They carry a sovereignty that unsettles others, for it exposes their dependency. Yet this sovereignty is the gift of clean empathy. It allows you to stand in love without chains, to serve without slavery, to feel without drowning. So I ask you, where in your life is empathy contaminated? Where do you give out of fear rather than freedom? Where do you merge in order to escape yourself? Look into your dreams, into your body, into the patterns of your relationships, and you will find the answer. It is not easy, but it is liberating. For once you discern clean from contaminated empathy, you will no longer live in confusion. You will no longer mistake martyrdom for love. You will no longer betray yourself in the name of compassion. Instead, you will embody a deeper compassion, one that honors both yourself and the other, one that flows from the self, inexhaustible and pure. There is within each of you a secret dialogue between your conscious ego and the unconscious depths, and this dialogue is often disguised as your relationships with others. When you feel the sorrow of a friend and cannot separate it from your own, you are in truth encountering your own inner figures. The friend becomes the stage upon which your inner drama is projected. You may think you are empathizing with them, but much of what you feel belongs to your own soul. This is why individuation is essential. It allows you to reclaim your projections, to withdraw the scattered fragments of yourself from others, and thus to see them as they truly are. Without this reclamation, your empathy will remain contaminated, for you will forever confuse the cries of your inner child with the cries of your lover, the wounds of your father with the wounds of your patient, the despair of your mother with the despair of the stranger beside you. In this confusion, you lose yourself and you lose the other. Clean empathy requires that you endure the pain of separation, the realization that not everything you feel belongs to the world around you, but to the inner world you have yet to face. To discern this boundary is to awaken. Do not mistake what I am saying for an argument against empathy. Empathy is the golden thread that connects souls. But like gold, it can be alloyed with base metals. Pure gold is incorruptible, but mixed with lead, it tarnishes and weakens. So too with empathy. In its clean form, it is the radiance of the self shining through the ego to meet the self in another. In its contaminated form, it is alloyed with fear, guilt, in trauma, and the desire to control. And because most people fear the descent into their own unconscious, they are content to live with the alloy. They accept contaminated empathy because it feels virtuous, though it secretly corrodes the soul. The contamination is subtle. You think you are helping, but in truth you are avoiding. You think you are loving, but in truth you are afraid. The unconscious is cunning. It dresses wounds as virtues. disguises fears as compassion. This is why so many empaths wear the mask of saints, while inside they are hollowed out by exhaustion. They have become containers for the collective unconscious vessels for the pain of others, because they never learned the sacred boundary. They did not know that empathy without boundary is not compassion but possession. And possession by another's unconscious is as destructive as possession by a demon, for in both cases you lose your own center. Consider the archetype of the hero. In its noble form, the hero faces the dragon of the unconscious, rescues the treasure, and returns transformed. But in its contaminated form, the hero becomes addicted to saving, rushing into every fire, not because the world needs it, but because their identity depends on it. Such a hero is not free. They are enslaved by their need to rescue. They empathize with every victim, but beneath their empathy is a hunger for validation, for a sense of worth that can only come from being indispensable. This is contaminated empathy, masquerading as heroism. The true hero knows when to act and when to step back. They know that to save everyone is to save no one, for it drains the very source from which salvation flows. I recall a patient who dreamt of a village drowning in floodwaters. She stood on the shore with a rope in her hand, pulling person after person to safety. But as the dream unfolded, the rope grew thinner, frayed, until it snapped, and she was left with nothing but strands in her hands. She awoke weeping, realizing that her entire life was spent pulling others from the waters of despair, while she herself remained on the shore, never entering her own waters. Her empathy was contaminated, for it kept her from facing her own flood. Clean empathy would have led her first into her own depths, to rescue the child within her who was drowning. Only then could she truly help another, not as a savior, but as a companion of the depths. This is the paradox. To cleanse empathy, you must first allow yourself to suffer consciously. You must feel your own pain without disguising it as someone else's. You must hold your own darkness without projecting it onto the world. Only then will your empathy be free of contamination. For empathy without self-empathy is an illusion. You cannot truly meet another until you have met yourself. And to meet yourself is the most terrifying act of all, for it strips away the masks of virtue and exposes the raw wound beneath. Yet this wound, once faced, becomes the source of your clean empathy. It transforms from a hidden compulsion into a conscious choice. The world is hungry for clean empathy. Most of what passes for compassion in the collective is little more than sentimental contagion, the herd rushing to feel together in order to avoid the loneliness of individuation. But collective empathy is contaminated by its very nature, for it suppresses the individual in favor of the group. Clean empathy is rare because it arises only in individuated souls, those who have faced the loneliness of separation and emerged whole. Such individuals can stand within the collective without being swallowed by it. They can feel with others without losing themselves, and their presence is healing, not because they carry the pain of the world, but because they reveal to the world that pain can be borne without collapse. There is another dream I must share. A man dreamt that he entered a vast cathedral filled with candles. Each candle represented a soul. Some were burning brightly, Others flickered. Others were nearly extinguished. He felt overwhelmed by the suffering of the dim flames and rushed to cup his hands around them, trying to protect them from the wind. But as he did, his own flame began to falter, for he was neglecting it. Then a voice echoed through the cathedral, "Tend your own flame, and the light will multiply." He awoke with a revelation that his empathy had been contaminated by neglect of his own light. He had spent his life protecting others at the expense of himself, and in doing so, he had dimmed the very flame that could have illuminated them. Clean empathy is tending your own flame so that it shines brightly, offering light by its very being, not by sacrifice. This is why the mystics speak of detachment. Not detachment as coldness, but as clarity. To detach is to see without possession, to love without clinging. Clean empathy is detached in this way. It does not merge compulsively, it witnesses. It does not rescue compulsively, it accompanies. It does not demand reciprocity, it simply is. In such empathy, the self shines through, untouched by contamination, and those who encounter it feel not drained, but empowered, for they are seen as they are, not as projections of another's wound. The task before you is immense, to discern, moment by moment, whether your empathy is clean or contaminated. This requires vigilance, honesty, courage. It requires that you ask, am I giving from abundance or from fear? Am I listening to the other or to the echo of my own wound? Am I merging because I love or because I cannot bear my own solitude? These questions are the guardians of the boundary you were never taught. Without them, you will be swept away by unconscious tides. With them, you will stand firm, a light in the storm, a presence that heals without being consumed. Do not be surprised if, as you purify your empathy, some people recoil. They are accustomed to your contamination, for it served their unconscious needs. They may call you selfish when you no longer carry their burdens. They may call you cold when you no longer merge with their despair. But this is their shadow, not yours. Your task is not to be what others demand, but to be whole. And wholeness will unsettle those who prefer dependency, yet wholeness is the only ground upon which true love can be built. For love without wholeness is always contaminated, always burdened by unconscious bargains. But love rooted in the self is clean, radiant, inexhaustible. The task of distinguishing clean from contaminated empathy is not merely psychological but archetypal. It is part of the eternal drama between light and shadow, self and ego, freedom and compulsion. When you practice clean empathy, you align with the self, the transcendent center that holds opposites in balance. When you remain trapped in contaminated empathy, you serve the complex, that splinter of the psyche that demands attention, that hijacks your energy in order to repeat an ancient pattern. Thus, the purification of empathy is inseparable from individuation itself. To walk the path toward wholeness is to learn again and again how to feel without drowning, how to love without losing, how to give without compulsion. In the unconscious, this struggle often appears in the form of dreams, where boundaries are tested. Some dream of being in a house where strangers continually enter, uninvited, moving through the rooms as if they owned them, this dream points to the torn membrane of contaminated empathy, where the psychic house has no door, no lock, no threshold. Others dream of walls so high and thick that no one can enter. A fortress of isolation, this is the opposite extreme. The defense against contamination, so rigid that it severs all connection. Both are distortions. The task is to dream a third way, the house with a door that opens and closes, the heart with a threshold that is honored. Clean empathy is the art of this threshold. The archetype of the threshold guardian appears here not as an enemy but as a teacher. In mythology, the guardian tests the hero, asking, "Are you ready to cross?" In your psyche, the guardian asks, "Are you ready to discern? Can you stand at the threshold of another's suffering without being pulled into it? Can you open the door of your soul without abandoning the child within?" These are the initiatory questions. Those who fail them remain forever trapped in contaminated empathy, confused between self and other, their boundaries porous, their lives consumed by burdens that do not belong to them. Those who answer them awaken to the truth that love requires strength, not sacrifice, clarity, not confusion. I must tell you something hard. Many of you secretly fear clean empathy. You fear it because it demands that you stand in your own being, and that is lonely. Contaminated empathy gives you an identity. You are the helper, the healer, the one who is needed. Clean empathy strips this away. It leaves you without a mask, without a role, simply present. To be simply present feels unbearably naked to the ego, which craves recognition through doing, but this nakedness is the beginning of real love, for it no longer depends on performance or compulsion. It is the presence of the self, silent, radiant, beyond all bargaining. In the myths, gods often tested mortals by appearing in disguise, asking for hospitality, for compassion. Those who responded out of clean empathy recognized the divine guest beneath the rags, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but out of a deeper resonance with the sacred. Those who responded from contamination either rejected out of fear or gave compulsively, hoping for a reward. The myths remind us that empathy is always a test, not of morality, but of consciousness. Can you meet the other as divine without projection, without bargaining, without losing yourself? This is the essence of clean empathy. And what of love? Many confuse love with empathy as if they were the same. But love is greater, for it embraces not only feeling, but willing, not only resonance, but choice. Love chooses to stand beside, even when it would be easier to turn away. Empathy alone may collapse into identification, into the flood of emotions. Love steadies empathy with will, but love too can be contaminated if it is bound by unconscious contracts. Clean empathy purifies love so that it becomes a union of freedom, not a fusion of wounds. When you love with clean empathy, you do not chain the other with your sacrifice. You walk with them, each carrying your own soul, each free, yet bound in mystery. The collective has no interest in teaching you this. The collective thrives on contaminated empathy because it produces obedience, self-sacrifice, and conformity. A society built on guilt needs citizens who feel too responsible for others to claim their own destiny. But individuation demands rebellion. It demands that you risk being called selfish, cold, unloving, in order to honor the truth of your soul. And in doing so, you discover that true compassion is far greater than the counterfeit the collective offers. It is not obedience but freedom. It is not compulsion but presence. It is not depletion but abundance. Perhaps you now ask, how shall I begin? Begin with attention. Each time you feel the impulse to carry another's burden, pause and ask, is this mine? Each time you feel drained after an encounter, ask, where did I abandon my boundary? Each time you feel compelled to rescue, ask, what part of myself am I refusing to face? This practice of discernment is itself a ritual of purification. Slowly, you will notice the difference between the weight of compulsion and the lightness of presence. Slowly, you will find that your empathy becomes less frantic, less exhausting, more luminous. You will find that you can sit with suffering without drowning, that you can love without losing yourself. And this is the birth of clean empathy. It is a birth, and like all births, it is painful. Something in you must die. The identity of the rescuer, the illusion of indispensability, the unconscious bargain of martyrdom, these deaths are necessary. Without them, the new cannot emerge. The self waits, patient but insistent, calling you to a higher form of love. When you finally release the contaminated patterns, you discover that what you thought was love was fear. What you thought was compassion was compulsion. What you thought was empathy was projection. And though this realization wounds the ego, it liberates the soul. For you no longer mistake illusion for truth. The deepest truth is this: you are not here to carry the world, but to illuminate it. The world does not need your depletion. It needs your wholeness. When you are whole, your presence alone is healing. You need not merge. You need not rescue. You need not sacrifice. Your flame burns, and by its light, others remember their own flame. This is the mystery of clean empathy. It gives without giving away. It loves without losing. It feels without drowning. It is the mystery of the self shining through the human vessel, untainted by shadow, unbound by compulsion. And so I say to you, guard the threshold of your soul, tend your own flame, face your own child, withdraw your projections, honor your boundary. Do this not in coldness, but in love, for love is not fusion, but recognition. Love is not sacrifice, but freedom. Love is not depletion, but abundance. When you live this truth, you will discover that empathy, once a burden, becomes a joy. You will walk among others not as a rescuer, not as a martyr, but as a presence, and your presence will heal, not because you carry their pain, but because you reveal to them the possibility of carrying their own. This is the boundary you were never taught. This is the wisdom hidden beneath centuries of sentimentality. This is the distinction between clean and contaminated empathy. And if you learn it, if you live it, you will no longer be consumed by exhaustion, no longer chained by guilt, no longer enslaved by compulsion, you will be free. And in your freedom, others will glimpse their own. This is the task of the individuated soul, to shine as a beacon, not as a savior, to love as the self loves, clean, radiant, inexhaustible,